I'm Chris Stafford, and this is AART, the podcast where we get to know the women behind their art.
If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll show you what I mean. If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll bring you to your knees. If you follow me.
My guest this week is botanical artist, teacher and exhibition organizer Carol Woodin. Carol was born in 1956 in Salamanca, upstate New York, inside the Allegheny Indian Reservation, which is one of two governed by the Seneca Nation of New York. Her father, James, was a construction worker, and her mother, June, a library clerk, who also enjoyed oil painting and playing the piano. Carol is the middle of 6 children with 4 brothers and 1 sister. Her childhood was one of making her own fun outdoors, and with sketchbook in hand, she pursued an early interest for art. At first, this would be still life and landscape paintings, until an introduction to orchids became a passion, and one that developed into a level of expertise that she did not plan on. In fact, she never wanted to be a botanical artist. Her foundation for illustration started in high school and then at the Williamsport Area Community College, now known as the Pennsylvania College of Technology, as a technical illustrator, where she was one woman amongst 50 men. But before she could make art her career, Carol spent time as a draftsman, surveyor's cartographer, a UPS manager, and for 3 years a tractor-trailer driver. In 2016, she married Paul Harwood, who is also a painter and a gardener. For the past 30 years, Carol has focused exclusively on botanical art as a painter, teacher, and exhibition organizer. Most recently, her work has been shown at the Jonathan Cooper Gallery in London, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., the Shirley Sherwood Garden in Kew in London, and the USB Galleries and Newhouse Galleries in New York, as well as the Museum de Zwarte Tulp in the Netherlands and the Marciano Library in Venice, Italy. Her work is also in numerous private and corporate collections throughout the Americas and across Europe. Carol was recently invited to contribute to the Grootbos Florilegium, a project to document and raise awareness of the Cape Floral Kingdom in South Africa. In 1995, Carol received a gold medal from the Royal Horticultural Society for her watercolours of Paphiopedilum orchids and was the recipient of the 1998 Boucher ASBA Award for Excellence from the American Society of Botanical Artists. In 2013, she received the first Lancaster Award for Orchid Art in Cartago, Costa Rica, and 3 years later, in 2016, she received the Orchid Digest Medal of Honor. Carol lives in Catskill, New York, where she also cultivates her own flora and fauna. Carol, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, would you normally be painting during the day, every day?
Well, I do paint. I try to keep painting nearly every day. I also have a job, so that ends up being later in the day. So usually I paint every evening at least, sometimes in the afternoon too.
And how long would those sessions be? Do you give yourself a block of time when you can then and say, okay, this is my time, do not disturb?
I do, what I try to do is no matter what is going on, I try to keep working. So if I have an hour, I will paint for an hour. If I have 4 hours, I'll paint for 4 hours. It depends on how much time I have. I just don't want to get so caught up in the minutia of daily life that I don't make room for that anymore. It's easy to do.
So it really is a discipline for you.
It is a discipline.
And what's the job then that distracts you from it?
I organize exhibitions for the American Society of Botanical Artists. So I came into that as a botanical artist, and I have long wanted to make botanical art kind of well respected in the world and more understood. So I thought that would be a great vehicle to help accomplish that.
Because you were telling me in an earlier conversation, Carol, how many women are represented in botanical art, which is really impressive. There's something like 90% of botanical artists are actually women.
I believe that's the case. I look at our own membership and I look at the botanical artists around the world, and I believe that's got to be fairly accurate number. Some countries have fewer females and more males, but I would say the average is about 90%.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when we look at history and women painters generically, that they have not been the majority in history for sure. And I think botanical art seems to have emerged over the years. Now, you've been doing it, 30 years now as a freelance? So you've probably seen those kind of changes of more women coming into it.
I've seen a lot of changes, and they're often quite surprising changes. When I first started, I really didn't. I probably knew 5 other botanical artists in the whole country, and I really felt it was a throwback because art galleries didn't really want to show our work. They looked at us as some, kind of maybe a field of illustration, something that they weren't interested in representing. And now it kind of has gradually increased. I think botanical artists have been influenced by a few of the people who were active in the 20th century and brought the art field, the art genre into the present by making it about ecology, making it about modernism, making it about design. There were a lot of things that changed, and also social media, of course, has made a huge difference in that artists don't need a gallery to mediate between them and people that are looking at their work. So there are literally thousands and thousands of botanical artists working around the world, and they refer to themselves as botanical artists.
And something that I read about you is that you are a woman in love with orchids. So was that the first attraction for you? What was the catalyst for actually sitting down with a flower or sitting down with nature?
There were a number of things that conspired to kind of bring me into this field, which, when I was growing up and when I was a young adult, I just really had no idea what was in store for me through this art form. But I was a hiker. I liked nature. And I had moved back to where I'd grown up in Western New York. And I had discovered that there were these incredible wildflowers out in the forest, out in the fields. And I started to be really curious about the more endangered plants. And that took me into native orchids, which surprised me that there are about 50 species of native orchids in New York State. And I started hunting them down. And that was part of the fun, going out in the woods and trying to find these really rare orchids, getting directions from people who knew where they were. And so that pulled me in. And then a friend of mine brought me a tropical orchid from a greenhouse, and they were just so unusual. They were so strange, such strange forms, such strange colors. And there was, I've always been interested in different things and novel things. And so that kind of pulled me in. And I didn't paint anything but orchids for about 15 years.
Yeah, it certainly was an obsession in a way, really, because you've perfected the art quite literally, haven't you, of drawing orchids. I want to go back to, you mentioned Western New York, upstate New York, where you grew up in Salamanca, which was interesting in itself because it was inside the Allegheny Indian Reservation. And that was back in the 50s, Carol, we'll say that quietly. You grew up there. Your father, James, was a construction worker, and your mother, June, a library clerk. And I'm curious because you were part of a fairly large family, 6 children. What that childhood was like for you? Were you the little girl that was always sketching?
I was that little girl. My family were interested in music. My mom played the piano, but she also did a little bit of painting on the side. And I think that, when I was in high school, I was in the band, and I became a French horn player, and I wasn't very good at it. And when I practiced, it was very loud, so all the neighbors could hear me. And I think that helped to drive me into quieter pursuits. And I became that kid that was always drawing. And, my whole life, that's kind of the way I looked at myself as an artist. And I love to draw and paint. I love to sketch. It was just the center of everything.
And was that the same at school for you? Were you mainly drawn to the art classes, or were there other interests?
Well, in school, I loved school, and I really liked math, which is kind of unusual, I think, for artists. But so when I graduated, I ended up going to school and becoming a mechanical draftsman. And I was the second female draftsman that Corning Glassworks hired. And so I did that for a while, but I became quite restless. And then, I never really got back to that. I did finally find my way in a very circuitous way to painting, and then into botanical art.
Yes, it was a tad circuitous because you did that. You were draftsmanship, and there's draftsmanship in the family you had mentioned, and surveyor's cartographer. And this is what I would not have actually put together in the same sentence: a tractor trailer driver. Where did that come in?
Well, I was working for Corning in North Carolina, and I just really wanted to see the country. I hadn't. When I was a child, we really didn't go anywhere. And so I was just in my early 20s. I was very restless, and I was not, financially independent. So I thought this would be a really good way to make a living, see the country. And I would also draw and paint while I was out there driving. As it turned out, it was quite a job. So I think I did one drawing in the 3 years that I drove, over the road. And so, but it was a great experience. There had been women out there before me, and there were women out there with me, but there were very, very few of them. And, it was kind of exhilarating in some ways and just really nerve-wracking in others. So when I finally stopped driving over the road, I didn't miss it at all.
What were the vehicles like, and how much weight were you pulling?
At the time, I think it was a maximum of, I think it's about 80,000 pounds. And the tractor itself, I can't even remember what they weighed, but it was an 18-wheeler, and it was the maximum length of trailer at the time, I think, was 48 feet. I think now it's 53 feet. But I think there's a quality that many of us have in our 20s, and it's an absolute, you're just not fearful. And I wasn't afraid to drive it. I had ridden a motorcycle for quite a few years, so it was Logical, and I never had an accident while I was out there. And it was a very physical job. And it was also before we had the GPS navigation. So every place you went, you know, you really learned directions, you really learned how to navigate. And I think I used that in my woodland navigations later in life, looking for orchids and extensive swamps and forests and things like that.
And what kind of mileage would you be typically doing in a day then when you were driving?
Well, there was a limit on the number of hours that an individual could drive. For quite a while, I had a partner, and we essentially kept the truck running, you know, the maximum hours that we could. We would drive to, there was a period of time when we had to have a 2-person operation. We drove from Binghamton to Houston to Dallas to Kansas City and St. Louis and back to Binghamton every week. So it was about 4,000 miles a week. So it's quite a few miles a day.
And you said you were happy when that was over. But what brought it to an end?
I just decided that it was time to get back to, I really wanted to get back to painting. And so I sold the truck. I sold out of the business and, you know, moved back to the area near where I had grown up. And then, as you probably have seen, I did a variety of jobs while I restarted painting again.
And what kind of jobs were they that you were doing until you found your groove?
Well, I did work for UPS for 3 or 4 years. I supervised the loading crew, and I did a little bit of driving for them, and I worked as a cartographer for a land surveyor. And then I think it was 1990, I just became a full-time artist. And that was when I started. It was really coincidental with starting to paint plants. So that was kind of the beginning, 1990.
And just going back to where you were born and raised there in Salamanca in upstate New York, what was that like as a child? You were one of 6. Talk a little bit about that and your appreciation for the fact that it was an Indian reservation, which you probably can reflect on now, but I'm wondering what it was actually like as a child. What were your fond memories?
Well, it was kind of an old-fashioned kind of life since, as you know, it was 50s, 60s, 70s when I graduated from high school. And we just had a big gang of kids, and our parents would essentially say, go away until dinner time. We would all be running around outside, you know, until dinner. We'd come in for dinner. We'd run back outside, and we'd build forts and tents and, you know, ride bicycles. And it was really kind of unstructured. We had to make our own fun. We had to kind of navigate the world on our own. And it was just comfortable, although it was a very small town. So there were a lot, you know, we didn't go a lot of places. So, you know, there are opportunities that I think a person in a bigger town or a person with a family that travels might have that we didn't have.
So you made your own fun, basically, as children often did in those days, in the 50s.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Yeah. So who would have been your early influences then in art? Were there any artists or any impressions that you had that influenced you that, you know, can you remember the work of those that as work you first admired?
Well, I do remember I really feel like my junior high art teacher was instrumental in teaching me the basics of art. she taught us like we were college students. She would set up still lifes. She had us drawing ellipses. She had us drawing, scaling out faces. And she really taught us the basics of how to draw. And I am always very grateful to her. To me at the time, she seemed like she was from another world. She was already close to retirement. And she seemed very old-fashioned to me, but I think that it was that quality that allowed her to teach us sort of like an old-fashioned atelier. We had to come in, we had to draw from life. We did models, we did setups. We just, she treated us as if we were older artists, I think. And I think that gave me such a good foundation in what all botanical artists consider is the absolute requirement of botanical art, and that is drawing skills.
And did she influence you in any way in the direction that you were taking with your art?
I don't think she influenced the direction, but she definitely provided that foundation and strength that I used throughout my life in art. I didn't used to do botanical art. I used to do still lifes and landscapes. So, but she made me able to do that right up to the present. I really look back at the lessons she taught us as forming the basis of everything that allowed me to actually feel confident in drawing and painting.
And even though your mother was a painter too, did she kind of leave your mind alone so that you developed your own way?
Yes, she did. I think she was a very hands-off mom. She wanted us to, do our homework and do what we were supposed to do. But she did let us go out and, interact with the world. And then just as long as we were home when we were supposed to be there.
You were home for dinner as it turned out.
Yes.
Right. You were all washed up and at the dinner table at dark, I can imagine. That was the style, though, wasn't it, in the 50s and 60s?
That's how everybody lived in those days, and every parent watched out for everybody else's kids.
Yeah, very much. You mentioned your mother was a pianist, too. So what's your musical influence? Where does it fit in your life?
I enjoy music, but I probably enjoy art more. So I do listen to music. I listen to mostly right now Americana, what they call Americana, which is, kind of a pile of different kinds of roots music. I used to go to a lot more live events than I do now. And if I'm going to go to a live event now, it's going to probably be a classical concert.
Does that help you when you're painting?
I don't listen to music when I'm painting. I usually listen to audiobooks. I listen to podcasts. It kind of keeps my mind more occupied. It sometimes occurs where I'm working on a particularly difficult passage in an artwork and I will completely lose track of the book and I'll have to rewind it. But it works pretty well to pass the time. I kind of go back and forth and I have to keep rewinding the book, but it does, if I'm working for 4 hours or so, it'll help me, it'll help keep me busy.
And busy would seem to be an element of what actually the environment where you're painting. It seems that you'll find a stillness there, a peace and a stillness when you're doing the kind of detailed work that you do with your drawings, with your paintings. Is that who Carol Woodin is? Are you a very quiet, still person?
I think I'm a I think I'm a natural introvert, and I have, because of what I do in life, I've kind of forced myself to be less so. But I really find that if I don't have time to paint, if I don't have time to sit down and, speak that language for a while, I just get really, really antsy. I have to paint. It's just something I have to do. If I can't paint, I just get anxious. I feel like life is slipping away. So it is a place where I find I have to go. And I really do love working, in a way, probably there's an aspect to it of problem solving. And there are so many problems in the world that are just unsolvable, but you can sit down with a painting and you can work your way through these things very calmly and peacefully. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle, but when you reach the end of it, it's just such a satisfying feeling to have sorted it all out. And then you have a thing that remains from all of that effort. It's also nice to have a product at the end of it. And I think that when you say that that's it's sort of a meditative place that you go to, it's an internal place. That's for sure. And I think that is one of the things that people that are being drawn into botanical art are being drawn to. I think they want that time away from the devices, from being a spectator, from being a listener, into being an actor, and into making something, and into making something out of their own head and out of their own hands.
And along with that satisfaction when you finish a piece, Carol, do you stand back and feel a bit like a rock star? I know some artists do. I'm one of them. It's enormously satisfying when you finish writing a book or painting a piece that you've invested so much to. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, I do. I'm not always thrilled with my result. I think it's a good thing to not always be thrilled with your result so that it drives you forward. But I really do. I feel a sense of accomplishment when something is done, when it's framed, when it's hanging, when it's sold. It just is it's very gratifying.
What does validation mean to you then for your work?
Well, I do the work really. I wouldn't say it's for personal gratification. I want, I think every artist wants something from their audience, and what I want is what a lot of botanical artists want, and that is for people to pay attention to plants. I try to portray them in a way that makes people stop for a moment and see something that they've never seen before, and then maybe it will make them look at the plant world differently. People don't tend to differentiate between plants. Plants make our very life possible, and even if things are green, it doesn't mean things are healthy. So just like all kinds of diversity in the world, we're losing plant diversity every day, both in the plants that are wild and the plants that we eat, the plants we use. So I'm out to, make people more aware of that. I like to look at the way I frame the paintings. They're sort of in a shadow box, and I want people to feel like they're looking through a window into a little treasure box that is this thing that nature has created. And I think that those two things are probably the major goals that I want to achieve with my work.
Because I'm sure when you sit with those plants, you sit in nature and you connect with them and you develop a very intimate knowledge of those plants too. So it's much more, as you said, than the painting. But does it have to be a commercial enterprise for you?
I do have to sell my work, yes. I do have to earn money through my work. So, for a time it was my only work. And when I retire from ASBA, it will be my only work again. And so I can't afford to do it if I don't sell the work. So I do sell work. I do teach. I do other things to earn money. I speak. So yes, I do have to sell them.
And you've been published, and that's the great thing about botanical art, is being published in important books too. So you're on the library shelves around the world.
Yeah, I have to say that is something that is really surprising to me and there's a lot of things about this field that I never could have imagined occurring at the beginning. But I did have, what you do in botanical art is you have this sort of interdisciplinary friendships and relationships that develop with gardeners, with, people that grow plants for a living, with botanical gardens, with scientists. So all of these people become your safety net, and they kind of guide you and sometimes push you to do something that will take you to the next step. And in the early days, I had a couple friends out near Ithaca who encouraged me to contact Kew Gardens and a scientist there about a slipper orchid book he was working on, since I was painting many of those slipper orchids. And he had finished that book, but he did take me on for a second book that he was doing. I had to send samples of my work, and he came over here to lecture, and I met him, and he and I ended up working on a project to illustrate. I illustrated, and he wrote the monograph of the slipper orchids of the tropical Americas. And that in turn led me to, traveling around this country to paint South American slipper orchids, and then traveling a few times to South America to study some of the slipper orchids down there. And that is something I never could have imagined doing when I was in high school or even in my 20s. I just never saw that path ahead of me, of course. And it has just evolved organically over the years. And it's always a surprise. And it's always, if I were to sit down and write down the number of places and the number of things that have occurred through this botanical painting, I'd just be astounded. So it's just been, what I can say is it's been a surprise.
And you've become an expert.
Well, I've learned a lot over the years. I've learned a lot about botany. I don't know, I'm not a botanist. The reason I could do botanical painting is because from the very beginning, from my high school, my junior high art teacher, Miss Maneri, from her teaching close observation, I've always been able to paint plants botanically correctly just because I paint what's there. So I didn't know anything about botany, but through the years I've learned about botany, and because I just paint in such a detailed way that they were botanically correct from the start.
I can imagine that your bookshelves are laden with botanical books, but what else would we find? Oh,
we'd find a lot of art books, a lot of big art books, we would find, I have read a lot of historical biographies of all kinds of people. I do read a lot of spy thrillers too. I've been through a lot of phases in my reading history.
What are you currently reading?
Well, I've been working through the series of Vera novels by Anne Cleves. They're British murder mysteries.
Yes. Have you solved any?
She's pretty tricky. I usually don't figure it out before the end, which is always
after you
good.
had been an artist in residence at the Oak Spring Garden Foundation in Upperville, Virginia, where you had spent, I believe, 3 weeks there. That was an experience must have been almost sort of made in heaven for you.
It was so multifaceted. It was so surprising. You know, I had been to the foundation a couple previous times because ASBA, we'd mounted an exhibition there and we've brainstormed with them a few times. But to live there on site and to be with 3 other fabulous world-renowned botanical artists we all stayed in the same house. That was lovely, and it was fascinating to watch them work. And then there were probably 10 other artists and writers in different disciplines in residence there. So that was one aspect of it. Of course, the gardens on the main estate, the formal gardens, are filled with all kinds of interesting subjects. And then they've developed a biocultural conservation farm where they're trying to preserve and grow plants that, agricultural crops that are historically significant to the Piedmont area of Virginia. So that farm is interesting. I'm working on a kohlrabi from there right now. And then you meet also people who happen to be passing through there. And that was an aspect of it I was not planning for. And it provided such a rich experience to be able to interact with people from different countries, different walks of life, all related to arts and plants. So all put together, it was just a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Yes, I can imagine a very rich experience for a botanical artist. And will you be coming back? Have you got plans to come back to Oak Spring?
Well, they do allow alumni to return. So the 4 of us are considering trying to figure out when we can all come back at the same time. So yes, I would love to come back.
And you mentioned those other artists was, of course, Australian Beverly Allen, whom I met, and John Pastoriza-Pinol, who also from Australia, and Jean Emmons. So you were quite an eminent small group at Oak Springs.
Yeah, and each of those artists has a different way of working, and just so remarkable to watch. You know, when you've got 4 artists walking into a garden, you think everybody's going to want the same plant. You know, there's going to be some drama queen out there in the garden that everybody's going to want to grab onto, but everybody looked and took different things, and we all went our own ways, subject wise, but and we were all kind of feeling our way through it, which was really, it was so interesting to watch.
Yes, a wonderful experience. Now, you also mentioned that you're teaching workshops around, not just around the country, but also overseas as well. And I believe you've got some plans this August to go to Denver and to South Africa later in the year. Tell us about those.
Yeah, Denver. I taught a Zoom workshop for them, during COVID, and I'm really interested in their farm. They also have a farm called Chatfield Farms. So the group will go up to the farm and we will find plants to paint, and then we'll come back to the garden to paint them. And then South Africa, I was invited a few years back to participate in a Florilegium project down there at the Grupos Private Nature Preserve. So we ended up going in December, I think it was 2021. And while we were over there, Omicron hit, which was an experience. But the flora in South Africa is very unique, very charismatic, so interesting. And they have a property which has, I think, 900 species of plants on it. And everything is different there than here. So, so the class I'm going to teach, I'm co-teaching it with Deb Shaw from California. We're going to be teaching the native flora there. We're going to go out and find some really interesting plants to paint. And we're going to devote at least part of the workshop to working on vellum, which is, natural vellum, which is a leather material, which is what I usually work on when I paint my watercolors. So that is an opportunity, and it's going to be a really wonderful couple of weeks in South Africa.
You mentioned, of course, most of your work is in watercolor, but are there any other mediums that you use and teach?
No. it's an easy answer.
It's exclusively watercolors. I'd imagine it would be. But do you pencil sketch first?
I do, yeah. I always do, since I started botanical art by working with native orchids, I learned a way of going out into the field. You can't pick the plants, you can't cut them, you can't dig them up. So I would have to go out in the field and do drawings and then color studies, and then go back to my studio and work from those. I took photographs too, but especially back then, the photos were bad. And even today, my photos are not good. So, what I learned is that the more time you can spend with that plant early on, the better off you'll be. I would do some sketches in the field. I'd come back. I'd think I had enough, and I learned that I didn't. So, and those flowers, those orchids, they would not be in flower again for another year. And then the next year they may not flower. So I really had to be careful to get everything I could. And that moved into the tropical orchids because I would be traveling somewhere and I had to get, so with those field sketches that I do, I'm, in addition to drawing them very carefully and doing some color work on them so that I can memorize the color. When you were saying you spend so much time with them, they become part of you. And that's what that study does. It sort of makes it be permanently impressed in your memory. So, then I take those studies back home and then I work from those. Of course, every now and then I do have the subject here in my studio, which is really luxurious. So it's good to sometimes be able to work from a specimen in the studio.
Now, all of this experience over the years, I'm wondering, as you've developed, have you influenced others? Have you influenced family members to take up botanical art at all?
well, none of my family members have taken up botanical art. I'm going to have to. I'm going to have to find out why. No, there's. I probably have influenced others to take up botanical art, but also, I think I was one of the very first Americans, anyway, to work on vellum. So people do come to me to learn about working on vellum.
And of all the things that you've done, Carol, in your career as a botanical artist, you've won awards, you've been published in books, as we've mentioned, and you've been part of collections and exhibitions. What would you say you're most proud of?
Oh, no. Well, I think, there's my individual work, but I think that working with ASBA and trying to guide themes of exhibitions toward botanically relevant issues, to bring those issues to the public, I think that has probably reached a lot more people than one person's work could ever do. So maybe that's it. All the exhibitions that I've helped to develop and guide at ASBA.
Is that what you would like your legacy to be?
Well, my legacy, of course, every artist wants their work to remain in the historical record. I'd like to be remembered as an artist, mostly. But I think all botanical artists, well, not all botanical artists, but many botanical artists today have become, once you are drawn into botanical art, you're drawn into plants. And once you're drawn into plants, you're drawn into the loss of biodiversity. So I think whatever we can do, even though it's, we're not making regulations, we're not changing politics, we're not changing laws, but I think that whatever we can do in our own way to raise awareness of what's going on in the world of plants, I think that's all working on the plus side of life.
Now, you mentioned that you're working on a piece that will go to Oak Springs, to the library. What's next for you this summer?
Well, I have a painting that I'm working on for that group Bose Florilegium. I had a second subject that I am working on. I'm going to get busy with that, and I am growing corn out in the garden. I'm able to paint 1 ear of corn a year because I can only grow one kind of corn a year. So I'm waiting to see what is produced out there, and I'm going to start working on that. So, and I have a number of paintings that are ready to paint, some native wildflowers that I started this spring that I'd like to get back to. So I've got a stack of paintings waiting. There's always more work than time.
Are you a keen gardener?
I do love to garden. I like to grow things that I can't find other places. I love to grow interesting things, and I always like to cut flowers, especially in the summer. Winters can be pretty long, even here in the Hudson Valley. So whenever summer is here, I like to be able to just go out to the garden and cut flowers and bring them in. So yes, I do.
So there is no shortage of inspiration for you then, even in your backyard?
No, there's lots of stuff out there too.
Wonderful. Well, I will let you get back to what you love doing most. And thank you so much for being my guest this week, Carol. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Chris, for listening and for having me.
And you'll find a link to Carol's website and her social media in the show notes accompanying this episode. And if you have a minute whilst you're listening to the show to leave us a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts, that always helps others find the show. So we would appreciate it if you could take a moment to do that. And you can also leave your comments, questions, or suggestions for guests by visiting us on Instagram at the AART Podcast. And that's art with 2 A's. My thanks again to Carol for joining me this week and to you for listening. I'll be back next week, so I hope you'll join me then.